The morning sun spilled like gold across polished marble floors. Light streamed through 30-foot glass panels, casting sharp reflections against chrome pillars and velvet-lined benches. It was a lobby that didn't whisper success, it screamed. It designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind every visitor they were standing inside the empire of something far bigger than themselves. Employees walked briskly across the floor, their heels clicking with practiced urgency. The air smelled of designer perfume and fresh-cut orchids. In this world of tech billionaires and blue-chip deals, precision wasn't a goal, it was the atmosphere. And at the far edge of this cathedral of commerce, pushing a battered grey cart, was a woman nearly everyone overlooked. Layla. Her uniform was plain, her steps silent, her presence almost ghost-like. Every morning, she moved through the building with the same quiet grace, emptying bins, wiping handprints, aligning magazines on the waiting tables with geometric care. Her eyes stayed low, never inviting conversation, never demanding space. Most people didn't know her name. Even fewer cared to ask. But Victor Hale noticed her that morning. Victor, towering, tailored, and always 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. The kind of CEO whose voice didn't need to rise to command attention. When he walked, conversations paused. When he smiled, people laughed whether they understood the joke or not. He stood near the center of the lobby that day, surrounded by assistants, lawyers, and investors, a leather-bound document in his hand, a contract written in a rare, ancient dialect, test translation prepared for a new AI language tool the company was developing. He waved the pages in the air, amused. "This one's a headache," he said. "Barely 5 people in the world could make sense of it." That's when his eyes caught Layla quietly cleaning the glass partition nearby. She didn't look up. She never did. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was arrogance. But something in him sparked. With a grin curling at the edge of his lips, he turned to his entourage and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "I'll give you my salary if you can translate this." The laughter was instant. A ripple of disbelief, of mockery, of indulgence. A tech titan joking with a cleaning lady was novelty, theater, a break in the monotony of conference calls and data reports. Layla paused, one hand still gripping her cloth. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Her face remained unreadable. Victor waited for a reaction, a smirk, a shrug, even a confused glance. But there was nothing, just silence, the kind of silence that lingers long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. And yet, somehow, Victor seemed pleased. The staff chuckled. The assistants exchanged amused glances. Even the security guard at the door allowed himself a grin. Everyone knew Layla barely spoke a word of English. She had worked there for months, and no one had ever heard her say more than a soft sorry or excuse me. She didn't belong in this world of code and contracts and billion-dollar IPOs. That was the unspoken truth. And yet, as she returned to her work, her eyes drifted just for a moment toward the document, still fluttering in Victor's hand. No one noticed, no one cared, but something passed through her gaze. Not amusement, not shame, just recognition. The lobby returned to its rhythm. Conversations resumed. Coffee was fetched. Deals continued brewing behind closed glass walls, and Layla, forgotten once more, continued polishing the floor, her reflection ghosting beneath her. The cold marble silently carrying the weight of something unspoken. Victor never looked back. Why would he? To him it was just a moment, a rich man's joke, lost in the wind. But the wind has a strange way of remembering the whispers that people ignore, and the marble. It remembers the steps of those who walk unseen. That morning, something shifted in the stillness, something invisible, the kind of shift that only reveals its meaning much later, like the pause before a storm, or the first crack in a mask. Layla didn't speak that day, but the silence had already begun to echo. The hum of the lobby softened as the moment passed. Conversations trickled back into motion like a river disturbed by a tossed stone, now settling into its natural current. Yet beneath that flow, something had changed. Victor Hale, the man whose words shaped futures, stood still, his smile slightly delayed, his thoughts momentarily elsewhere. Across the marble floor, Layla turned her head. For the briefest second, their eyes met, not in defiance, not in fear, just stillness. Her gaze was calm, neither challenging nor submissive. Just there, present, unflinching. The bustling world around them seemed to blur. Footsteps echoed softer. Laughter faded. The high walls and expensive air turned hollow, as if the building itself was watching. Victor wasn't used to that. He was a man accustomed to reaction, nervous laughter, admiring glances, hasty agreement. But Layla offered him nothing. No fluster, no fear, no flattery, just silence. And silence has a weight when it comes from someone who has carried it for too long. Victor turned away first. He laughed, louder this time, brushing off the unease that brushed him first. His entourage responded on cue, chuckling, moving on. The contract was handed to someone else, a new task assigned, new headlines to chase. The moment was supposed to be over, but in the recesses of his mind, a question remained, lingering like a drop of ink in still water. Was that defiance? Layla, meanwhile, adjusted the handle of her cleaning cart. The metal frame squeaked softly as she pushed it forward. The sound echoed through the lobby, a small, forgotten sound, barely noticed among the clicks of designer heels and elevator chimes. But it was the only sound that belonged entirely to her. Her pace was steady, her posture unchanged. Yet there was something invisible now, walking with her. Something Victor couldn't quite name, and that she didn't need to show. In her hands, the white cloth gently pressed against a steel railing, wiping away invisible fingerprints. She moved with care, with rhythm, like a ritual. Not just cleaning, but preserving something. A presence, a dignity no one saw. She didn't look back, not once. Behind her, Victor watched from the reflection of a glass wall, eyes narrowing slightly, the smirk fading, just a little. His world had never made room for mystery unless he'd created it himself. But Layla's silence, it wasn't mystery born of manipulation. It was born of something deeper, something ancient. The kind of silence that holds a memory, the kind that knows what not to say, the kind that doesn't tremble under weight, but grows strong beneath it. And in that lobby lit by sunlight and ambition, Victor Hale felt a flicker of unfamiliar emotion. Discomfort, not fear, not shame, just a tiny crack in certainty. The kind that makes a man glance twice. The kind that keeps him awake longer than usual that night. Somewhere in the corner of the lobby, Layla reached for the last bin near the elevators. Her movements, still gentle. Her breath, steady. Her face, unreadable. But her eyes, they had already said what needed to be said, without a word, without a blink, without flinching. And though no one noticed, the moment left a mark. Not on the floor she polished, but in the air, in the energy, in the echo of a stare that didn't cower. In a world where power spoke loudly, something small had whispered back, not in volume, but in stillness. And somehow, that was louder. Night arrived gently, folding itself over the city like a dark velvet cloth. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting golden halos onto the damp pavement. Cars moved slower now, their headlights stretching like ghostly fingers across quiet roads. In the heart of the city, windows blinked with life, some glowing with warmth, others humming with tired silence. Up on the 4th floor of an aging apartment building, a single light burned dim behind a curtain that had faded from white to ivory over time. Inside, Layla sat in stillness. Her small apartment was modest, no more than a few rooms, each marked by its quiet simplicity. The walls were bare, save for a single photo on a shelf. A younger Layla, standing beside a woman with wise eyes and a soft, proud smile. The hum of a small fan filled the space with a low, steady sound. On the kitchen table lay her cleaning gloves, a worn towel, and a paper coffee cup half full from earlier that day. But in her lap, something older rested, heavier, alive with memory. It was a book, leather-bound, the color of midnight soil. Its edges frayed, its corners softened by time and travel. The spine cracked gently as she opened it, revealing a delicate dance of symbols and letters etched in ink, so old it had begun to fade. This was not an ordinary book. It didn't belong to this place, this time, this world of glass towers and elevator pitches. It belonged to something quieter, something sacred. Layla's fingers moved over the page, slow and reverent, not reading, remembering. Each symbol, each curve of the script, stirred something deep within her, not just memory, not just skill, but identity. Long ago, these symbols had shaped her world. She had grown up surrounded by them, spoken in the songs of her people, etched into the wood of old doors, whispered by elders during moonlit stories. Her mother had taught her to read them before she could write her own name in English. They had once been her first language, and then they were gone, not erased, but buried buried beneath displacement, silence, and survival. Layla turned another page. Her eyes scanned a passage she knew by heart. It was a lullaby, written in a tribal dialect now nearly extinct. A lullaby her mother used to hum when the world felt too loud. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the melody form in her mind, not as sound, but as sensation. A warmth behind her ribs, a presence. So much of her life now existed in silence, in blending in becoming invisible. But here, in this book, she found her reflection again. Not the woman in the janitor's uniform, but the girl who had once stood proudly before a panel of translators, reciting languages no machine could grasp. The student who had been promised scholarships, opportunities, futures that shimmered just beyond reach, until the ground shifted, until home was no longer safe, until silence became the only way to survive. She didn't lose her voice, she had buried it, and tonight, quietly, she was unearthing it. Outside, the city moved on, unaware, but inside this small apartment, something long dormant stirred, not rage, not revenge. Just the quiet pulse of awakening. Layla turned to the final page of the book. Tucked between the parchment was a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, its ink faded, but still legible. Her mother's handwriting, a farewell note from the last time they had spoken. Don't forget who you are, even if the world does. Layla held the note to her chest. Not to weep, not to mourn, but to remember. She wasn't always a cleaning lady. She was a scholar, a linguist, a daughter of a lineage steeped in knowledge most had forgotten. She had once stood in rooms where people listened when she spoke, and though she hadn't spoken loudly in years, the silence was not emptiness, it was storage. And now, the pages of this forgotten book had started to open more than just memory. They were unlocking something else, a reason, a purpose, a path forward. Not to reclaim her past, but to honor it. As Layla gently closed the book, the air in the room seemed to shift, softer, fuller, not with noise, but with knowing. The kind of knowing that can't be taken, only carried. And now she was carrying it once again. Morning rose quietly over the city, its golden light touching glass towers and weathered rooftops alike. From above, everything looked peaceful, orderly, like a world waking into routine. But beneath the surface, something had begun to ripple. It started with a single upload, a quiet click in an office corner. A receptionist, half bored and half amused, had captured a moment she thought was funny, trivial, and worth sharing. The clip was short, grainy, just under 30 seconds. It showed the CEO of a rising tech empire, tall and self-assured, waving a document in one hand as he turned toward a silent cleaning lady. The caption read, "I'll give you my salary if you can translate this. CEO mocks janitor." She didn't expect much, maybe a few likes, a handful of reposts, but by noon, the algorithm had chosen it. By evening, the world had it spread faster than the CEO's speeches, faster than any product launch the company had ever rolled out. Internet thrives on contrast, and this one was too sharp to ignore. A billionaire and a janitor, power and silence, laughter and stillness. Memes emerged before the hour ended. Tweets flooded timelines, news headlines followed, eager for a bite of virality. Rich CEO dares, janitor internet explodes. Modern royalty mocks the help. Translate this, arrogance in real time. The laughter turned outward. People mocked Victor for his arrogance. They mocked Layla too for her silence, her stillness, her invisibility. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Some called her brave, others called her nothing. But Layla, she said nothing at all. No response, no statement, not a single word. She simply continued moving from floor to floor, room to room, as she always had. The same uniform, the same careful pace, the same quiet eyes. But now, people stared longer. Some with curiosity, some with ridicule, a few with regret. Yet Layla did not shift. She pushed her cleaning cart like she always did, her hands steady, her movements unchanged. The viral world spun fast, always hungry for the next thing. But within Layla's silence, time moved differently, lower, quieter, more deliberate, because while the world had just discovered her, she had already begun to rediscover herself. The book at home still rested on her table, its pages waiting, its words ready, its weight growing heavier in meaning with every passing hour. But the world didn't know about that, not yet. To them, she was still a question, a mystery. a symbol to project upon of injustice, of patience, of irrelevance. And Victor Hale, he watched the storm from behind tinted glass and carefully worded statements. He hadn't meant for the video to go viral, but it had, and now the joke had taken on a life of its own, not just a moment anymore. A story, a message, a mirror, and at the center of it all, a woman who had never asked for the spotlight, a woman who never spoke a word in her defense, because sometimes silence speaks loudest when the world forgets how to listen. And in her silence, Layla waited, not to be seen, but to be ready. The break room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon-scented disinfectant. Its walls, once a dull beige, were now tinted by the cold glow of fluorescent lights overhead. Chairs scraped the linoleum floor, and vending machines buzzed softly in the background like distant static. This was the quiet corner of the tower, the place where exhaustion briefly exhaled, where ties loosened, shoes slipped off, and eyes stared blankly at phones. A place where even hierarchy took a step back, at least in appearance, but not anymore. Since the video surfaced, the air had changed. It was thinner now. Layla entered, with her cleaning cart as she did every evening, her routine unbroken. But eyes rose now when she moved. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Whispers replaced casual chatter. Some people pretended not to see her. Others stared too long. She had become something else. A symbol, a spectacle, a viral shadow walking silently among the living. Even her own co-workers, those who once nodded kindly or shared leftover pastries, now stepped aside, as if her presence was contagious, as if silence could stain. But Layla didn't flinch. She emptied the bins with the same quiet care, aligned the chairs, wiped the smudges from the glass table. Her motions were soft, nearly invisible, like wind brushing through still air. And then, when the room emptied, she sat not for rest, though her body ached, but for something else. On the break room table lay a napkin, plain, white, crinkled at the corners. She unfolded it slowly, smoothing it out beneath her palm. From her pocket, she pulled a pen borrowed, fading, and began to draw. The ink whispered its way across the napkin, forming loops, slashes, dots, symbols, not random, not scribbles. Language, a language most eyes would never recognize, a language from the past, from before this building, before this silence. Her hand moved with practiced memory. She didn't need a reference, only quiet, and in that quiet, her fingers brought the forgotten back to life. Every symbol held weight, every curve held memory, a lullaby, a proverb, a promise. Soon the napkin filled with patterns that felt ancient and alive. She folded it again, tucked it into her sleeve, and reached for another, then another. Coffee cup lids, the back of receipts. Anything blank became a page. She wasn't just remembering, she was reawakening. In a world that had reduced her to silence, she was beginning to speak again without uttering a single word. Each line she drew was a thread, pulling her back to who she once was, to the young girl who translated poems for scholars, to the daughter who watched her mother recite languages into the wind. She stayed long after the machines went quiet, after the last light in the hallway dimmed. She was alone, yet never more. Full. This was no longer just a break room. It was a sanctuary, a place where identity, buried beneath mops and mockery, had started to return softly, steadily. And though the whispers outside the room would grow louder, Layla had found something louder still, a truth that spoke not through sound, but through symbols inked in silence, a voice that lived between the lines, waiting, patient, powerful. Before skyscrapers filled her view, before cleaning carts and cold stairs, there was a home lit by lanterns and stories. The memory comes like a quiet breeze, carrying dust from another lifetime. It begins in a small stone house, tucked beneath the low hills of a forgotten land. The walls were rough, but warm, their cracks filled with earthen care. There was a wooden table in the center, marked with tiny carvings, a map of meanings only two people understood. Young Layla sat cross-legged on a woven rug, her feet tucked beneath her, a notebook resting on her knees. Opposite her sat her mother, radiant, in a threadbare shawl, her eyes soft and endless. Her voice, calm and deliberate, danced through dialects, like wind moving through trees. Each night, they recited together, words older than nations, spoken in rhythms passed down by grandmothers, etched into bone and memory. Layla's voice, though small, echoed with certainty. She pronounced each phrase with reverence, each sound carefully placed like a stone in a sacred path. Her mother watched with pride, not the loud, showy kind, but the quiet pride of knowing something was being preserved. They didn't speak just to remember. They spoke to survive. Her mother had once taught in grand halls, dignitaries, decoding lost languages, preserving the dying breath of cultures on the edge of erasure. But then came politics, then came exile. Now, they lived simply, quietly, but never voiceless, by candlelight. She'd teach Layla how the tongue holds truth, how language carries the soul of a people, how silence, when forced, becomes a cage. And on one particular night, a night darker than the others, her mother's voice was softer than usual. The wind howled outside like a warning. Shadows moved past the window, slow and uncertain. The oil lamp flickered. Layla looked up. Her mother closed the book. She leaned closer, her breath warm and trembling, and in a voice that barely carried, she whispered, "Never let them silence your tongue." It was not just instruction, it was a plea, a farewell folded inside a phrase, because that night, her mother disappeared. There was no knock, no warning, just absence, a scarf left behind, a window left open, an empty space where a voice used to be. Authorities offered no answers. Neighbors lowered their gaze, and Layla, she never forgot that whisper. In the years that followed, she would carry those words inside her, hidden beneath layers of survival. They would echo during long, lonely nights, during border crossings, through the silence of crowded waiting rooms in unfamiliar cities. She stopped speaking them aloud, but she never stopped hearing them. The language of her mother lived on, not just in books, but in the way Layla noticed the weight of words, the rhythm of silence, the space between syllables. She became a vessel of memory, even when the world renamed her, even when she was reduced to a title on a name tag, even when her hands were used to scrub floors instead of turning pages. The language stayed, folded into the corners of napkins, etched onto lids, guarded behind her eyes, because some voices, once planted, never die. They become roots. They grow, in secret, beneath the surface, until the world forgets them. And then, they bloomed out. Now, years later, in a city that never knew her story, her mother's voice still lived. Not in echo, but in becoming. Layla had not forgotten the words. She had become the words. Late one evening, long after the polished halls had emptied and the hum of ambition had quieted into silence, Layla returned to the lobby. The lights overhead were dim now, flickering slightly as the building settled into sleep. Outside, the city pulsed with distant sounds, cars gliding over wet pavement, sirens threading through fog, and wind pressing softly against the tall glass windows. Inside, the world was still. The receptionist's desk sat vacant, its screens gone dark. Security cameras blinked lazily in the corners. Layla moved quietly, her footsteps absorbed by the marble floor. She wasn't here to clean, not tonight. On the far end of the reception counter, tucked beneath a stack of neglected paperwork, was the document. His document. The one Victor had waved so carelessly, the one that had sparked laughter and headlines. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the empty room. Then, with careful hands, she lifted the top sheet and slid the paper from beneath the pile. The pages felt heavier than they looked, not by weight, but by something deeper, like history pressed into parchment. She unfolded it slowly, and in an instant, the ink came alive. The symbols weren't foreign to her. They were familiar, intimately, so more than language, they were layers. Every line was built with intention, every word chosen for dual meaning. To most eyes, it looked like a linguistic exercise, a passage from an old manuscript, perhaps a dialect lost in time. But to her, it was a message buried beneath the ink. Layla's breath caught as she traced her fingers over the margins. It was a contract, yes, but one that danced in deception. The real meaning hid between phrasings, concealed beneath the folds, of idioms from ancient tribes whose speech patterns camouflaged intention. And suddenly, she saw it. Not just what the document said, but what it hid. Embedded in its ceremonial tone was something sharp, language often used in old war treaties, terms that signaled permanent silencing, phrases that once meant displacement, retraction, and burial. Her eyes widened. This wasn't a translation test. This wasn't a joke. This was a cover-up, a deliberate attempt to seal something away, something legal, yes, but also historical, cultural truth, masked as paperwork, and Victor had waved it in the air like a toy. Layla stepped back from the counter, her mind suddenly louder than the silence around her. A soft tremble moved through her hands, but her spine remained straight. Her chest rose, slowly, then stilled. Everything made sense. Now the secrecy, the obscure dialect, the buried phrasing. The company was hiding something beneath the veneer of linguistics. And Victor, he either knew, or he didn't care to know. She folded the paper again, slowly, carefully. Her movements were no longer timid, they were deliberate. This wasn't about a salary, or a viral clip, or a dare meant to humiliate. This was about erasure, and her hands, long used to silence, had just uncovered the weight of a hidden truth. The fluorescent light above her buzzed softly. The clock on the wall ticked, but Layla stood still, the paper pressed to her chest, not with fear, but with clarity. The code beneath the ink had revealed more than corporate dishonesty. It had shown her what she still carried, what she still was, not a shadow, not a whisper, but a reader of hidden languages, a guardian of meaning. And now, the silence she'd worn for years began to feel different, not like surrender, but like preparation, because soon she would speak. The building's heart beat differently. After hours, lights dimmed, doors locked, footsteps softened to echoes. What was once filled with suits and meetings now hummed only with the quiet rhythm of electricity and forgotten voices. In the belly of the tower, past a maze of security doors and concrete stairwells, was a narrow room few ever entered. It was cold here, sterile. Rows of blinking servers stood like metallic sentinels, humming softly beneath cables that coiled like veins. And there, in the low blue light, Layla waited. She had never belonged to this world of circuitry and code. But tonight she stood inside it, calm, still, knowing in her hand the document trembled only slightly, not from fear, from truth about to be revealed. A soft click echoed through the corridor. A door opened. A figure stepped inside. He was barely more than a silhouette, nervous, wearing a badge too new to have weight. A junior intern, just a kid really, but with eyes that had seen enough to recognize the gravity of what she carried. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Layla handed him the folded paper, the same one Victor had once mocked, now vibrating, with meaning neither of them could ignore. The boy set it beside the terminal, scanning it into the system, fingers tapping with practiced speed. Lines of code streamed across the screen, searching, translating, pulling from ancient dialect libraries and buried legal archives. The silence in the room grew thick. Each flicker of the monitor revealed another layer, another mask peeling away. What emerged from the digital ink wasn't just hidden phrasing or vague legalese, that it was a system, a network, a machine built not from code, but from silence. The document had been designed to mislead, to appear as harmless policy while hiding something dark beneath its folds. Offshore transfers, untraceable donations, gag orders disguised as goodwill, dozens of signatures buried inside clauses, people silenced, stories bought, and at the heart of it, Victor Hale's name, over and over, not just approving, but orchestrating. The intern's fingers hovered above the keyboard. His throat tightened. This wasn't just a bad deal. This was criminal. Layla stood behind him, her reflection faint in the black glass of the server racks. Her face didn't shift, not in anger, not in fear, just quiet understanding. She had known something was wrong, but now she saw the shape of it. A scandal dressed in paper, buried under translation, invisible to everyone, except her. The servers around them continued to hum, indifferent to the truth they guarded. Machines didn't care about justice. They only stored what they were told. But Layla, she remembered everything. Her mother's words, her own silence, the way language could be weapon or shield. And now, for the first time in years, she wasn't holding truth alone. She had found an ally, a single thread in the system, young, unnoticed, but willing to listen. In the quiet of the server room, two people breathed the same air. One, born into a world of code. The other, into a world of ancient symbols. And yet, they spoke the same language now. The language of truth. Slowly, Layla folded the original document once more, the weight of it softer in her hands, now not because it mattered less, but because she knew what to do. Outside, the city slept, but beneath the glass and steel, something had awakened. Not a scandal, a reckoning. And it had started with whispers, in silence, in symbols. In a server room, where secrets had no place left to hide, dawn pressed gently against the tall glass of the building, casting pale reflections on polished floors and mirrored walls. Another day had begun on schedule, on brand, uninterrupted, except for one man, Victor Hale. In his corner office, high above the city, he stood still, hands folded behind his back, watching the skyline through a pane of silence. Behind him, reports blinked to life on a wall-side screen, news mentions, shares, data feeds, and buried among them, a ripple, a whisper he hadn't expected. Somehow, someone had seen through it. The document he thought unreadable, the words he thought dead, the language he believed extinct, now breached. Victor didn't panic. He calculated. The world hadn't seen the full truth yet. The media was quiet. No leaks, no headlines, only tension in the air, like the scent of rain before a storm. But Victor had always been a man of preemptive strikes. He scrolled through staff logs, eyes narrowing, patterns emerging. A name surfaced, one he hadn't thought about since the day of the joke. Layla, just the cleaning lady, or so he'd told himself. But now, something didn't add up. Too quiet, too steady, too present in places she didn't belong. The intern had slipped up. Its logs were never as private as people believed. The pieces were forming a picture he didn't want to see. She knew. And in that knowledge, Layla became something else entirely. Not a bystander, a liability. Turned from the window. His voice was cold, sharp, and final. Security. Get her out. Elsewhere in the building, Layla moved, as she always had, gently, deliberately, unnoticed. Her cart glided across the smooth floor, wheels squeaking faintly with each turn. The day had begun like the others, but beneath the surface, she already knew. She had felt it in the glances, in the silence that lingered just a beat too long, in the way her ID badge didn't scan at the West Wing entrance. The machine didn't beep. It paused, then blinked red, and that was enough. She didn't rush. She didn't ask. She simply turned her cart and moved back down the hallway. And as she did, two men in suits appeared at the far end of the corridor. Security, not rushed, not aggressive, just inevitable. They called her name. She didn't flinch, didn't speak. Her hands rested gently on the handle of her cart, one thumb brushing across the edge of a folded napkin tucked neatly between the plastic bins. A napkin lined with symbols, a language they'd never understand. They approached slowly, professionally. One of them looked unsure. He knew her face, had seen her every day. The other simply said what he was told to say. Her access was revoked, her contract terminated, effective immediately. No explanation, no reason, no space for questions. Just out. Layla nodded, not in defeat, in understanding that this was how the powerful cleaned their messes, quietly, ruthlessly, without trace. But what Victor hadn't realized was this: Layla had already translated more than a document. She had translated his pattern, his arrogance, his fear, and fear always acts too quickly. As they escorted her toward the elevator, she didn't look back, because she knew, you don't need to shout when truth is walking beside you. And now, truth was following her, out of the building, into the light, and toward something even Victor couldn't silence. The rain had begun gently, like a whisper from the sky. Thin sheets of silver fell across the city, turning its edges soft and reflective. Lights blurred behind droplets. Pavement shimmered like quiet rivers. The world outside the tower moved slower, now cleaner, somehow, as if being rinsed of its noise and illusion. Layla stood beneath a rusted awning beside the building's loading dock. In her hands, a cardboard box. Inside it, a faded sweater, a pair of old gloves, and the napkins, folded and worn. Ink bleeding faintly where water had crept in. Behind her, the door had closed, locked. Final. She didn't look back. Raindrops ticked gently against the box as she set it down on the concrete. Around her, the city carried on. Umbrellas opened, headlights cut through mist, footsteps splashed hurriedly past her. But within her, something had shifted. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was full, alive with knowledge, with meaning, with something ready. She crouched beside the box and carefully unfolded the napkins, one by one. Their edges curled in the damp air, but the symbols remained. Even as the ink softened, the truth they carried stayed sharp. Here were the words she had remembered in silence, the ones her mother whispered through exile, the ones she had rediscovered through memory and instinct and loss. But now, they weren't just memories, they were tools, they were keys, they were weapons. Not the kind that harmed, the kind that exposed, Her fingers moved slowly over the lines she had written. One napkin bore the translation of the document Victor tried to hide. Another, the phrases from old tribal laws designed to preserve dignity and freedom. A third, held names she had connected through the intern's research. Everything was here, not digital, not stored in a cloud, but raw, handwritten, real. Each letter, a quiet rebellion. The rain fell harder now, soaking the sidewalk and streaming down her coat sleeves. Still, she remained, head bowed, napkins spread before her like sacred parchment. She wasn't thinking about revenge, she was thinking about justice, about all the people who had been silenced by the very same arrogance that had tried to silence her. About how easily power hides itself in paper. About how the world rarely notices the ones it steps over, until they decide to stand still and speak. Layla gathered the napkins and placed them inside a clear plastic sleeve. The kind meant for protecting old photographs, the kind her mother used to store letters. She sealed it carefully, held it to her chest. A breath rose deep from within her, breath she hadn't released in years. Not just air release, because what she carried now wasn't weight, it was momentum. Victor had underestimated her. He thought silence was ignorance. He thought language was his tool alone. But she had been raised by a woman who taught words not just as form, but as fire. And now, her silence would end not with a scream, but with sentences sharper than steel. She stepped into the rain, no umbrella, no shield. The plastic sleeve held close beneath her coat, protected like scripture. She walked slowly, purposefully, away from the tower that had once consumed her days. Each step peeled away what they had tried to make her forget. Not a janitor, not a ghost, not a joke. She was a witness, a translator, a daughter of truth. And now, she had the words, words they wouldn't see coming, words they could not unhear. And this time, the world would listen. The rain had passed, leaving the city washed in soft morning light. Everything glistened: pavement, branches, rooftops, like a world dipped in silver. But far from the bustling towers, in a quieter quarter lined with ivy-covered walls and iron gates, time moved differently. It was here, in a stone building half swallowed by moss and history, that Layla arrived. She stood at the entrance of the University Archive, an aging cathedral of forgotten languages and buried records. Its tall, wooden doors creaked under their own memory as she stepped inside. Out of the noise, into stillness. Inside, the air smelled of parchment and dust, an aroma older than digital time. Shelves stretched into shadows, filled with relics, letters, scrolls, treaties, dialect dictionaries with brittle pages. The echoes of forgotten voices lived here, tucked between the lines of the past. And into this hush, Layla moved softly, like she belonged, not as a visitor, not as a stranger, but as something returning. A figure emerged from behind a desk, an elderly professor in a worn cardigan, sorting files with fingers stained by ink and memory. He looked up at the sound of her steps, expecting nothing more than another lost student. But then, his gaze paused, his breath caught. He tilted his head slowly, and then, with disbelief, whispered, "Through time," he said, "Layla Moran, the child prodigy." The name hung in the room like a song not heard in years, and for a moment, Layla said nothing. She only stood there still, present, changed. But the name stirred something inside her, something old, something sacred. Because, once, before cleaning carts and silence, she had worn that name with pride. Layla Moran, the girl who spoke 12 dialects by age 12, who read inscriptions most scholars couldn't decipher. The child linguist brought in by a peace coalition to decode ancient treaties between warring nations. They had called her a miracle, a bridge, a symbol of what language could do when it healed instead of divided. But the world doesn't always protect its brightest, and when her mother vanished, so did Layla's place in it, until now. She followed the professor into a quiet study room, its walls lined with case files of international conflicts and letters marked confidential. The lights flickered softly, casting shadows that danced over old maps and worn atlases. He brought out a folder, thick, heavy with time. Inside, documents she had once translated, her own notes, her handwriting, her mark. It was all still here, unforgotten, even when she had forgotten herself. The professor looked at her, eyes filled with reverence and sorrow. The world had moved on without her, but the archive had remembered, and now she had returned to the very place where her voice first found power. Layla sat in silence, her hands resting lightly on the pages. The lines of her past shimmered beneath her fingertips. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't grief. It was recognition. She wasn't becoming something new. She was reclaiming what had always been there. The polyglot, the prodigy, the daughter of wisdom, an exiled Dot. And now, no longer hidden Dot in that quiet university room. The woman who had once been mocked for her silence was being remembered for her brilliance. Her name spoken with awe. Her legacy preserved in ink. Her voice ready to return. Because a life interrupted is not a life erased. And some stories, some names, some languages will always find their way back. The room was dressed in luxury. A stage of white marble. Banners stitched in gold. Lights softened to cinematic perfection. Everything was measured. Every flower, every chair, every soundbite prepped for headlines. Victor Hale stood beneath a glowing screen that shimmered with the company's emblem. Behind him, a graphic displayed the phrase, "A New Global Future." Journalists, gathered like vultures dressed in suits, pens ready, lenses sharpened. It wasn't just a press conference, it was theater, a script written in power. Victor smiled. His voice was smooth, practiced, each word clipped for clarity, delivered like currency. He spoke of expansion, partnerships, innovation. He used phrases like shared vision and global trust. The crowd nodded, the room pulsed with agreement, but outside, beyond the walls of control, rain touched the sidewalk once more, and in it stood a figure not soaked this time, but prepared. Layla in her hand, a folder wrapped in plastic, the napkins, the printouts, the decoded truth. She wasn't dressed for stage, she wore no makeup, no polished heels, only the calm of knowing something others, didn't. Single quotes T. Security at the door barely glanced at her. She moved like she belonged, and sometimes that's all it takes. Inside, the speech continued. Victor raised a hand, cueing a graphic of foreign flags woven together, the illusion of unity, the performance of transparency. But then a sound, soft, at first, shoes on polished tile. All heads turned. Layla stepped into the light. She moved down the center aisle, unhurried, calm. Some cameras swung her way. A few recognized her. The cleaning lady from the viral clip, the silent woman behind the CEO's joke. Victor's eyes froze mid-sentence. His mouth parted, but no words came. And then she spoke. "Shall I translate your lies, Mr. Hale?" Her voice was soft, clear, unapologetically firm. The room paused. Cameras clicked, pens stopped. Breath caught in her hands. The folder opened, and what spilled from it wasn't outrage. It was evidence. She held up the napkins, the very ones she had once scribbled on in silence. She read, not loudly, but deliberately, the clauses Victor had buried. The offshore accounts, the hush agreements masked in ceremonial language, the real meaning beneath. The ink. The truth no one in the room had thought to look for. And as she spoke, the atmosphere shifted. Victor tried to interject. Security moved. A few staffers signaled frantically from the sidelines. But it was too late. The words had already left her mouth, and they could not be pulled back, because they weren't just words, they were history. They were wounds reopened. There were names, UNBURIED. One journalist stood. Then another. Questions fired. Not at her. At him. Suddenly, the stage looked smaller, the lights too bright, the banners too thin to hide behind. Victor stepped back, eyes darting. A man whose empire had never accounted for a woman who could speak. Layla didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply placed the folder on the podium and turned away. And as she walked out, cameras followed her. Not for scandal, but for truth. She had entered a room not meant for her, and left it rewritten. Their press conference was meant to be a celebration, a coronation. Instead, it became the beginning of an undoing, because one voice, once ignored, once mocked, had chosen to speak, and the world, at last, was ready to listen. The room was no longer his. Victor Hale, once towering in every room he entered, now stood diminished beneath studio lights. Cameras buzzed softly. Livestream counters ticked upward by the second. The world was watching, yet for once, not for him. Across the stage stood Layla, not in defiance, not in vengeance, but in presence. Still, balanced, weightless, yet full of gravity. The documents lay open before her, no longer napkins, but scanned, printed, magnified. Truth presented with care, not chaos. There was no podium, no banner, number, prepared statement. Just a simple microphone, adjusted by hands that had once scrubbed marble floors in silence. The backdrop was plain. A soft grey curtain behind her swayed faintly, moved by the same quiet current now running through the audience. And then she began. Her voice was low, measured, but not timid. She spoke in the first dialect, one so old that even subtitles struggled to keep up, a language not heard on television in decades, one her mother had once taught her beneath a flickering oil lamp. It rolled off her tongue like prayer, gentle consonants, winding vowels, a rhythm older than the building itself. The audience stilled, the rustling of papers stopped, fingers froze above keyboards. Her words wove the opening lines of the hidden document, each clause that had been disguised, softened, buried in false meaning. And then she paused. A breath, a shift in energy. Then came the second dialect, sharper, from a mountainous region far from cities and conferences, a tongue of survivors, tribes who never wrote laws on paper but remembered them in song. And through that song Layla spoke again. This time the crimes emerged clearer. Not just contracts, but betrayals, exchanges made in silence, paid in exile. A murmur moved through the crowd, but she didn't look up. Instead, she turned the final page and began the third. This one, modern, recognizable, the common dialect of policy, business, politics. And here, she stripped the disguise entirely. Her voice no longer translated. It revealed, clause by clause. She read aloud the intentions masked behind legalese, how the partnerships were purchased, how the voices of local leaders had been bought, how the languages of nations were used against them. And then, the line that echoed one sentence, she spoke with quiet steel. Here are your crimes, in every language you ignored. The room held its breath. Victor's hands twitched at his sides. His throat tightened. Because here, now, in front of cameras and history, it was no longer about interpretation. It was about exposure. Truth, not translated, unveiled. Across the globe, people watched. Some saw only the headline, "Janitor confronts CEO." But others saw the deeper truth. A woman who had once been silenced using words, now using words to awaken a world. She had no army, no title, no wealth. Only fluency in pain, in history, in the languages that mattered and those that were buried. As she finished, Layla looked not at Victor, but at the crowd. And for the first time in the entire ordeal, they didn't see a janitor. They saw a translator of truth, a daughter of exile, a voice that had endured mockery, dismissal, and silence, and still chose clarity over chaos. Victor's empire began to crack, not with a scream, but with a sentence. And it was Layla's, because some revolutions do not need fire. They need only a voice. Finally, beautifully, heard, the elevator rose in silence. Glass walls revealed the city, pillar towering, humming, distant. Layla stood at its center, composed, a sealed folder in her hands. The same hands that once gripped mop handles, now holding evidence sharp enough to cut through empire. Floor by floor, she ascended, not just through the building, but through the very hierarchy that had kept her beneath notice. This was not vengeance. This was gravity, finally restored. The doors opened, quietly. The boardroom beyond was carved in cold, luxury, polished walnut walls, leather-backed chairs, brushed steel fixtures catching the early sun like muted fire. A long table stretched across the room, where the company's highest sat. 12. Silent, waiting. Victor Hale sat at the head, his confidence worn thinner than his tailored suit. His smile was there, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not anymore. Layla stepped forward. No one stopped her now. No one could. She placed the folder on the table. The silence that followed felt longer than any speech. Inside the folder, digital logs, translated documents, internal transfers, confidential communications, and something heavier than all of it, her mother's influence, the legacy of knowing what words can both reveal and protect. One board member opened the file and began reading. Then another, and another. Their brows tightened, their hands stilled. A slow, dawning unease began to fill the room. Victor shifted in his chair. He leaned forward, tried to speak, but was met with a raised hand. The board's general counsel had seen enough. The embezzlement wasn't buried anymore. The false charity funds, the backdated contracts, the trail of hush payments, all signed, all traced, all real. Victor reached for his glass of water. His fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, from unraveling. Then came the voice of the elder board member, measured, tired, unforgiving. She saved us from ruin. For words, that was all it took to shift the weight in the room. Victor rose suddenly, the mask cracking beneath his skin. But he no longer held the room. He had once ruled it with silence and fear. Now silence worked against him. A motion was filed, and unanimous security, already briefed, entered the room. Victor didn't shout, didn't fight. He simply looked at Layla as they approached. But her eyes didn't burn. They held no triumph, only closure. This wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. He was escorted out step by step, past the windows that once displayed his kingdom. Now, they watched his fall. The door clicked shut, and, in that soft sound, an era ended. Layla remained for only a moment more. She didn't take a seat, didn't offer a speech. She had already said everything she needed to, in ink, in dialects, in the truth they had refused to read. And now, they had no choice but to listen. She turned, walking back toward the elevator, her reflection moving across the boardroom glass. The woman they had once ignored had not just spoken. She had translated collapse, and in doing so, she had become the one thing Victor Hale never foresaw: indispensable, unforgettable, and finally, free. The wind whispered through the alley behind Layla's apartment, quiet, unhurried, as if carrying something solemn. Shadows stretched long across the old stone floor of her building, where ivy crept slowly up the walls, and the days passed in silence. It was a place without extravagance, a room above the noise, modest, small, but hers. Inside, sunlight filtered through a single curtain faded at the edges from years of morning light. The air was still, filled with the scent of dried tea and old pages. A kettle rested on the stove, untouched. The world, for a moment, seemed paused. Then, a knock at the door. Soft, deliberate, as if the moment knew it mattered. Layla opened it slowly. On the floor a single envelope, no markings beyond her name, handwritten in careful script. No courier, no footsteps down the hallway. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the letters. Back inside, she sat at her worn wooden table. Around her, symbols drawn on scraps of paper still hung near the bookshelf, pieces of her journey, fragments of resistance. They had once been shields. Now, they were silent witnesses. She opened the envelope. Inside, a check, the amount impossible, a figure that once belonged to luxury and ridicule. Victor Hale's final paycheck. The same salary he'd once laughed about, waved in her face like a dare, and beside the check, a letter. Typed, but at the bottom signed by every board member. The message was brief, formal, heavy with consequence. You earned this, and more. There was no grand apology, no reparation, that could reverse the past. But within those words, something else lingered. Shame, recognition, a shift that had come too late. The kind of sentence written only when truth has forced silence to speak. Layla held the paper quietly. She didn't smile. She didn't weep. Her face remained unreadable, because the check wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. It was weight. It was a memory, now dressed in irony. She placed it on the table, gently, and then turned her gaze to the window. Outside, the city shimmered beneath a soft, overcast sky. Buses passed. Children laughed in the distance. Somewhere, a wind chime danced in the breeze. Life moved on, as it always does, but something in her chest remained still anchored, rooted. This wasn't the ending, not yet, not for someone who once translated peace for a world at war, not for someone who carried 1,000 dialects inside her, even when no one cared to ask. The salary signed in shame, delivered in silence, would never define her, because value was never in the numbers, it was in the quiet, in the pages, in the mother who taught her words were sacred, and in the moment she chose to use them, not to destroy, but to illuminate. She folded the letter back into the envelope, left it beside her tea, and returned to her chair by the window. There, beneath the pale light, she closed her eyes, not for sleep, but for remembering who she had always been. Morning sunlight filtered through the skyline, bathing the towers in amber light. The city stirred quietly, wrapped in routine, unaware that within one of those towers where glass gleamed like polished stones, something had quietly shifted. The revolving doors turned slowly. The marble floor inside still shone, as it always had, waxed to a perfect gleam. The lobby, once filled with indifferent glances and silent hierarchies, now greeted each day with the same polished ritual. But today, the rhythm changed. She stepped in, not with cleaning gloves, not with the janitors, Cart. But with quiet confidence. A long coat draped her shoulders. A subtle pin on her collar bore the company's crest, its edges refined, its symbolism finely deserved. She walked past the reception desk, past the place where once she was overlooked, barely seen. Now, eyes followed, not with ridicule, but with respect. Some stood, some whispered her name. And not all recognized her at first. Not in this form, not with her chin raised, her stride measured, her presence no longer apologetic. Layla Moran, head of Global Communications. She moved through the halls that once felt endless. Each footstep carried more than memory, it carried weight and grace. Glass conference rooms reflected her as she passed. These were the same rooms where she once emptied trash bins, unheard, unseen. Now, inside them, teams looked up as she moved past. Some nodded, others offered small smiles. Respect isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's simply the silence people give you when you enter a room. The elevator doors opened before she could press the button. Someone had already sent it down for her. She stepped inside, alone. As the doors closed, the mirrored walls reflected not just a woman, but a return, a reclamation. She watched the floor numbers rise. 10, 17, 22. Top floor. The doors opened to light. An expanse of windows flooded the executive level in gold. The view stretched far, past the city's edge, past the glass towers, out to the horizon where clouds drifted like ancient ships. And there it stood, the glass office. Once a throne of arrogance, now something else entirely. Its door bore a nameplate. L. Moran, head of Global Communications. She stepped inside. The room was spacious, elegant, but not ostentatious. A subtle rug softened the floor. Books lined one shelf, treatises linguistic, journals, and the forgotten histories of dialects long dismissed. A single photograph rested on the desk, a woman and child seated beneath a tree, both mid-sentence, caught in the joy of speaking. Her mother and her Layla sat down slowly. She let her fingers run across the polished edge of the desk, not to claim it, but to feel its reality. Outside the glass, the city moved like a quiet film. Below, employees passed through doors she once cleaned. Now, they passed her office with glances of recognition. She had returned to the place where her silence was mocked, not to fight, not to boast, but to rebuild, to guide, to speak on behalf of every voice that had once been shamed into quiet. She was not the hero in a headline. She had become something rarer, an echo turned architect, a name once whispered, now written in full. In a building once designed to overlook her. Now, it bowed, not out of guilt, but because she had risen. Quietly, completely, unforgettably. The sky was overcast that morning, not dark, not threatening, just quiet like it, too, had paused to remember. Along the outer edge of the city, where buildings gave way to quiet hills and stone walls faded into earth, Layla walked alone. The ground beneath her was soft with moss and old rain. Each step left no sound, only memory. She carried no briefcase, no folder full of revelations, only one document folded, aged by hands and time. The same one Victor had once mocked her with, now fully translated, fully understood, and now, complete. Rows of headstones rose gently from the grass. None were extravagant, just names carved in stone, standing still while the world changed around them. Layla's feet slowed near one, not marked with status or story, only a name, Amira Moran, mother, linguist, voice of the forgotten. She knelt slowly, placing the paper at the base of the stone. Her fingers lingered on its edge, as if letting it go meant giving away something sacred. The air around her was cool, touched by the whisper of wind through leaves. A lone sparrow passed overhead. The world didn't applaud, it only listened. Layla sat in the grass, her coat gathering dew. Her gaze was fixed, not on the grave, but on the horizon behind it, a space her mother had once spoken of in bedtime stories, a place where languages lived beyond borders. Her voice, when it came, was gentle, not for the world, but for one person. You were right. They tried to silence my tongue, but I made them listen. The words floated outward, caught by the breeze, not dramatic, not loud, but real. She didn't speak of the boardroom, of the cameras, of the paycheck, or the glass office. None of that mattered here. What mattered was that her mother's words had stayed with her. Not just the syllables, but the courage behind them. And in the end, that courage had spoken louder than any mockery. She leaned forward, gently brushing dust from the etched letters. Her mother had given her a gift not of power, but of understanding, a gift the world never saw, but Layla had carried it anyway, even when the world looked away, even when it laughed, even when it turned language into a cage. She closed her eyes. For a moment, it felt like her mother was beside her again, not as a memory, but as a presence in the wind, in the stillness, in the truth of her journey. Not all legacies are loud. Some are whispered, and then spoken, and finally, lived. Layla rose gently. She left the document there not as proof, but as offering. She turned back toward the city. Her shoulders no longer carried shame. They carried story, history, pride. Behind her, the wind lifted the edge of the paper. It rustled softly as if the grave had exhaled, as if the language they never learned had just spoken back. The room was quiet, not with tension, but with anticipation. Beyond the vast glass wall, behind the stage, the sea shimmered under morning light. Soft ripples moved across its surface, barely noticed, but endlessly powerful. Inside, beneath sweeping arches and golden lights, the world's most influential voices sat in silence. Ambassadors, leaders, media giants, all waiting for the opening speaker. She stepped into view, steady as tide. Layla, not the janitor, not the translator, not the scandal's survivor. But the woman who made the world listen, one language at a time. She wore no jewelry, no flash of privilege, only grace. A subtle pin on her collar shimmered under the lights-on emblem, formed of woven characters from multiple dialects. It was the logo of the new global coalition for endangered languages. She reached the podium. The audience leaned in. Then her first words came, not in English, not in French, not in Mandarin or Spanish, but in the rare dialect Victor Hale once mocked. The same tongue that had once been ridiculed in a marble lobby now opened a global summit. The syllables curled gently into the air, ancient, fluid, musical. Few in the room understood their meaning, but all of them understood their weight. She paused, and then, in common tongue, words build worlds, and silence is not weakness, it's a loaded pause. The phrase didn't echo because of the microphone. It echoed because the room had forgotten to breathe. She didn't speak quickly. She didn't command. She invited. She wove a tapestry from history and memory, from the villages where languages lived without ink, to the boardrooms where words were weaponized. She spoke of a world that underestimated silence, a world that confused quiet for ignorance and patience for passivity. But in that silence, she said, lived centuries, wisdom passed from mothers to daughters, not in textbooks, but in lullabies and laments. Her story wasn't unique, it was universal. Every culture, every nation, has a voice someone once tried to erase. And yet, voices return, in songs, in justice, in people like her. She didn't name Victor Hale, she didn't need to. His story was already in ECHO, absorbed, dissolved, and left behind. What mattered now was that the dialect he mocked was now being archived, taught, celebrated. What mattered was that a woman once paid to clean the halls of power was now building there blueprints. She ended her speech with another phrase, again in the rare tongue. This time she translated it. The wind that waits behind the mountain is still the wind, a metaphor, a memory, a message. The audience rose in silence, not for applause, but in reverence. Layla stepped down, not to retreat, but to return to the world she had helped shift, quietly, completely, and forever. Outside, the sea kept moving, gentle, vast, unstoppable. If this story moved you, let it be one of many. Subscribe, and stay for the echoes of voices once forgotten, now finally heard.